questions.
We've heard a lot this morning about the mob running scared. But, you know, animals run scared. They sometimes become very dangerous. Is there any fear of a backlash or that they may become more dangerous as a result of their top people being plucked by these indictments?
Well, I don't know if the mob can really become any more dangerous than it is. In this indictment alone, we mentioned 5 specific murders. In other indictments, in other cases, you've got 20, 30 murders mentioned in another indictment, alleged in another indictment, and I don't know that the mob can become any more dangerous. I think that's something that the agents and the policemen who do this work live with all the time, and it's a great credit to them that every single one of the individuals named in this indictment was arrested. It was done without incident, without anyone being harmed, which we are all very thankful for. So I don't think there's anything now that makes us any more cautious or worried about the fact that they may be dangerous.
Aren't there lieutenants to move up? The death of the mob in itself, they're calling it the dying gas. Is that what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't call it either, Chris. I would say this is a very major blow against the Mafia in New York, and I think it helps throughout the United States because the New York families have great influence throughout the United States. But we shouldn't call it the death of the mob or a dying gas. We have a lot of work to do. Many more cases have to be developed, as Director Webster indicated, not only here but throughout the United States. I think we have had more success in the last 2 years, both here in New York and nationally, than ever before in history in the effort against the mob. But that should be a prologue to the future, not the completion of the task.
Aren't there lieutenants to take the place of these leaders, Mr. Giuliani?
At this point, the indictment does not allege any forfeitures, but the investigation is continuing.
Mr. Giuliani, aren't there lieutenants to take the places of these bosses?
Well, there are always people that take places of other people. I mean, that happens in drug operations, it happens in organized crime operations. This indictment concentrates on the heads of the families and the commission. I should note that that is not, by any means, the full sum and total of the FBI and the police department's efforts here. As has been outlined before, a couple of hundred Mafia and organized crime members and associates have been indicted in the last year to 2 years. So that the attack is at the top level, the middle level, and the lower level. And we are doing everything that we can to identify, indict, and convict the capos, the soldiers, and the associates of the Mafia as well. Because if we don't do that, exactly what you say could occur. People could just move in and take over. We're going after the people who might take over, too.
Mr. Giuliani, some of the things that they said on the tapes in Avellino's car were fairly insulting to each other. And these allegedly being men of honor, as they call themselves, are going to get a little bent out of shape about that. One guy saying another guy's not the boss, and another guy saying that the other guy married the right woman and that's how he got ahead, and so on and so forth. Do you think that this is going to cause the kind of personal friction that's going to have them start whacking each other out?
Well, I mean, they seem to do that for all sorts of reasons anyway. So I don't know that this is going to increase it or decrease it. There's no doubt there are revelations on these tapes of a personal nature. They're of no concern to us. The things that we're concerned about are the revelations on the tapes in which they admit being members of the commission, they admit being heads of the families, they identify themselves as bosses, underbosses. On these tapes, they use the word mafia, they use the word La Cosa Nostra. I think these tapes put to rest an awful lot of myths and romanticizing that has gone on about the Mafia and about the mob, which I must say is enormously frustrating to people in law enforcement.
Do they talk about making members, adding members?
They talk about making members, they talk about the numbers of members they have to make, they talk about what you have to go about in order to be made. As I said, they identify the commission by name numerous times, both on the tapes that Mr. Goldstock mentions and the FBI tapes.
Do to become a member, a made guy?
I can't go into detail on them. Frankly, I'm not certain whether those conversations are yet public or not, so I can't comment on it.
Over the last 3 years, there have been in excess of 4,000 indictments so far. A number of persons identified as being soldiers, capos, capodicines in the Cosa Nostra and the Mafia. Nationwide, Kansas City down, St. Louis, the top's gone down, Boston, Philadelphia, New York City now, along with California. What is, subsequently, the position of the Mafia today? Does it exist as an integral organization? Is it scattered a bit? Is it reuniting? What is it doing?
I think I'd like to ask Director Webster to answer that question. He would have a much better national overview of it than I would.
Well, it'll just be my personal assessment of where I think we are. As you pointed out, there have been major hits against major players in every national crime, every prominent crime family in the country. The traditional LCN groups are only part of this effort. We're going against the outlaw motorcycle gangs that have been growing in recent years, the drug cartels, the enterprises spawned in prisons. What we see is the effect of all of this. You can't, we can say, yes, the Cleveland organized crime family is out of business, which it is currently. But what we really are seeing is the level of information, cooperation, and vulnerability that is emerging from this as we have been able to reach beyond the streets up into the upper echelons of each of these organized crime families. And with this indictment, we take on the symbol of power, the symbol of control and coordination that has existed with impunity for all these years.
Mr. Webster, an appeal was made this morning for witnesses to come forward and to tell what they know. Yet Mr. Giuliani says that this is not a major death blow against the mob, although it seriously has hurt them. What guarantees of safety can you give people who might want to come forward and testify against members of the mob?
Well, there are several avenues by which good citizens can serve us by supplying information. In many cases, they will never have to be witnesses. The information itself will lead to evidence we can introduce in court. There are others who have been involved in one way or another. The corrupting of businesses, for instance, the corrupting of labor unions has produced individuals who've been sucked into the process and in minor ways have become subject to criminal involvement. These witnesses can be handled through the Witness Protection Program. This is the approach that we're taking. Many have elected to be resettled and relocated without going through the program itself. There are a number of avenues. The important thing is for good citizens to know that we will do something about this information. And for others who want to strike a bargain with the government and minimize their losses, it provides yet another avenue to reaching up to the top.
Mr. Giuliani, this commission, thousands of these indictments have come down over the years.
Did you change the
What is your
rules, Graham?
conviction rate, and what do you
change them?
expect will be your conviction rate of these major
There was
figures?
one right there.
Well, I don't really like to use conviction percentages, and I certainly don't want to predict that we are going to convict anybody or not convict anybody. We've alleged these charges. We have to prove them beyond a reasonable doubt. The conviction rate of the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York is about the same as the conviction rate of all the United States Attorney's Office, which is about 95%. That includes people who plead guilty. When people go to trial, the conviction rate is about 90%. Yes.
I get the impression that the murder of Carmine Galante was the largest public assemblage in Brooklyn since the Dodgers left. Now, my inference is that Rastelli ordered up the Sicilian mob, and then the commission refused cert on the appeal. Is that, is that what happened?
Well,
Are they using the Sicilians because there's a shortage of hitmen in the United States?
Well, if you put both indictments together, the Badalamenti indictment and this indictment, what you essentially have is an allegation that the commission authorized the murder of Carmine Galante. In particular, two members of that commission were involved in that authorization directly, according to the indictment, Delacroce and Rastelli. And that the result of that was that Sal Catalano, who is named in the Badalamenti indictment, took over the direct business that Carmine Galante was involved in, which was narcotics trafficking, in particular narcotics trafficking with the Sicilian Mafia.
Mr. Giuliani, does this commission affect or control organized crime only in New York City, or to what extent does it affect the rest of the country?
The indictment alleges that it is made up of the 5 families in New York, and that at times other families from outside of New York have been members of it, and that it has influence beyond New York City and all throughout the United States. Those are the allegations that are made.
Could you elaborate at all on that? Could you elaborate?
I really can't go beyond that.
In 1960, you said that in 1960, you were told that organized crime did not exist. Were we naive at the time? Did we have bad investigatory powers? Was it part of a conspiracy to keep people from knowing that it existed? Why, in 1960, were you led to believe that there was no such thing?
Well, I think the answer is the Amorte principle. We'd had Appalachia by that time. We'd made an effort to do something about a particular gathering and meeting, We were simply short on information. Now, today, in the FBI alone, the Organized Crime Information System is the most sophisticated computer program that we have. We have a terminal in Rome, working with the Italian authorities there to identify Sicilian and other groups doing organized crime in this country. Bits and pieces of information that were not recognized as significant now fill out the picture. Plus, as I've said, the successes breed successes. As we begin to get off the streets and reach top players, more and more people are coming to us, giving us information, so we're getting the evidence that we simply didn't have in the past.
Many of these people put up a fight when they were arrested this morning.
No, they were arrested without incidents. My understanding, one was in the hospital and 2 others checked into the hospital.
Heart condition. How many?
This talks about the labor union corruption here in New York, and Professor Blakey, who was referred to here earlier, says that the only way that we really can end up going after the mob is to start taking over some of these unions and putting them into trusteeship so that new people won't come up and take over. Does the FBI have any plans to bring cases along those lines?
Well, of course, that's a policy decision, and I think beyond the scope of my responsibility, it's our responsibility, and we're trying to fulfill it, to identify connections between labor leaders, labor figures, and organized crime members. Take the Pendorf case in Chicago, where we had the connections between organized crime members and labor figures and those engaged in bribery. These unholy alliances have been allowed to fester for many, many years, and certain unions, particularly those involved with certain types of labor activities, restaurants, high cash intensity locations, have been gradually taken over by associates of organized crime organizations who are in the pockets of the MAID members. These associations are going to be a principal target of the FBI in the months and years ahead. And it is very important that we deal with this.
Mr. Webster, are these indictments likely to spark a wave of violence and other people trying to gain control of the commission?
Well, as Rudy pointed out, that's pure speculation. They're already a pretty violent group. The Bonanno family's done a pretty healthy job on itself. Out in St. Louis, there have been bombings that have reduced the number of active members that we had to investigate. And there are other things that are going, and there will be struggles for control. We've seen that in Philadelphia. We've seen it in other places. The important thing, I think, is that all of this will give us additional capacity to investigate and prosecute as these activities occur. The struggle for control, I think, will take an interesting twist with this particular indictment. Being at the top isn't always the best, I think, anyway.
Mr. Giuliani, in early February, we reported that you traveled personally to Tucson to interview Joe Bonanno, the exiled crime boss, in connection with this case in relation to the commission and his knowledge of it. What, if anything, was he able to tell you, and how do you intend to use him in this case, or the details in his book?
No comment. I can't comment on that one way or the other, confirmative or denied. I have no comment. Reader, I should add to Judge Webster's answer that we certainly do have plans to bring cases against various unions, not only involved in this case, but particularly involved in some of the other cases that have been brought up earlier.
Rudy, there are a lot of people in this city who are probably more afraid to ride the subways than to walk into a mob-controlled pizza shop. And if you had to convince these people that these indictments have a significant impact on their lives on a daily basis, how would you convince them?
First of all, I don't really want to convince them. The conditions in the subway and on the streets are also things that law enforcement has to deal with, and the actions of the mayor and of the police commissioner, and the minor assistance that we give them with federal day and bringing cases into the federal court so that we can help to some extent with that problem are things that we do also. So that one of the things that happens when you announce an indictment like this, that I guess is always somewhat frustrating for us, is you concentrate on this case, and it sounds like, well, maybe we're not doing anything else. I mean, there are three of us from the United States Attorney's Office here now. There are 126 others back there doing other things that have relevance to that issue, and particularly with the police department and Ms. Holzman's office. And I mean, those are things that have to be addressed also. So what's been done to the mob is not to the exclusion of doing things about drug trafficking, crime in the streets, white-collar crime, all the other things that are very important. But organized crime has a very great relevance to the condition of crime in an urban area, particularly in New York. Now, the heroin trafficking that causes so much of our violent crime was, up until a short while ago, and probably even now, controlled very, very largely by the Sicilian Mafia, by the Mafia. They have a lot to do with it. Estimates are that 50 to 60% of our violent crime is heroin-related. The mob profits from that, and it helps build a market, like any business will build a market for heroin. It creates a condition of violence. For those people who become involved with the mob, whether they're in the concrete business, whether they're in the vending machine business, whether they're in the private partying business, they might as well be living in a totalitarian state, because if they don't do what the mob wants them to do, they will be murdered, they will be beaten, their children will be harmed, and we have one incident after another like that that will come out in these various trials. And finally, it has a tremendous impact on our economy. Things cost a lot more in New York, and New York is a less desirable place to do business because of what the Mafia does to New York. And unless we change that and turn that around, New York is going to be permanently hurt by it. So it has relevance to everybody's life. And too often, an awful lot of people romanticize the mob. They paint them into Hollywood figures that are worthy of respect, or they make jokes about them, and that has a devastating effect on the ability to convince people not to cooperate with them, not to work with them, to come forward and deal with lawful authority. I think, having been in law enforcement over 15 years, if I could point to one thing that has helped perpetuate the mob and made it more difficult for law enforcement, it is the silly, romantic picture painted of them by too many people that are profiting from writing things like that.
Mr. Giuliani, without the wiretaps and the bugging technology?
Absolutely. The FBI's use of court-authorized electronic surveillance is one of the 3 or 4 principal reasons why we are able now to get to this level when we have not been able, at least in this quantity, to get to that level before. The use of court-authorized wiretapping, the use of the Witness Protection Program, the use of the RICO statute are the 3 principal reasons, as well as the commitment and the cooperation of all of these agencies that you see here today.
Mr. Giuliani, the fact that you're an Italian-American, does that bring any special passion to cases like this?
Well, yes, sure. That's a heck of a word you selected, passion, for an Italian-American. I guess that we sort of have that in our genes or something. Sure, it brings something to it. The fact of the Mafia historically has done great damage to Italian-Americans directly. When they were coming here at the turn of the century, it was the Mafia, the Black Hand, the Camarista, and those groups that lived off Italian-American immigrants and took what few dollars they made. And since then, the image of the Mafia, unfairly, I believe, has hurt Italian-Americans. I say unfairly because it has always been an extremely unfair prejudice. The Mafia, at its height, was only a very small, minuscule proportion of the Italian-Americans in the United States. And if you consider that in comparison to any other group that has a percentage of people that violate the law, it was probably at no greater than and smaller than most. So that Italian-Americans have been disconnected from and have had nothing to do with the Mafia, and most of them feel more strongly opposed to the Mafia than probably anybody else in our society, but they've been hurt by the existence of it. And I would see it as a very, very fine day for Italian-Americans if we could rid ourselves of it in reality, and there'd no longer be a Mafia. And then prejudiced people would have nothing to pick on. Probably they'd find something else, but at least that one would be gone. Thank you.
Thank you. Arraignment detail.
We can get over there.
Down in front.
Yeah, we've been busy. Let's see, do we have everybody there?
Is that a lined up?
Let me, I'm sure you know everyone here, but let me just see if I can just tell you where they're seated so that you know for sure. This is obviously directed as a Special Assistant United States Attorney to work on this case from Ms. Holtzman's office. This is a great day for law enforcement, but this is a bad day, probably the worst, for the Mafia. This case charges more Mafia bosses in one indictment than any ever before. This indictment identifies and charges 9 defendants as members and associates of the Commission, the Mafia's ruling council in New York, and other cities. The United States Attorney's Office and I are very proud to have been a part of. There are going to be speakers from several different offices here, but we all promise to be brief. Each one of them personally and their offices have made invaluable contributions to this case, and without them, Jim Kostler, Pat Marshall, so many other agents, it was their conscientiousness, creativity, and guts that got us where we are. Director William Webster of the FBI has been involved, as has Steve Trott, in the planning and development.
A really significant day in the criminal justice system. Those represented here on this platform are visible evidence of the and with particularly with Rudy Giuliani's leadership, the analysis of these crimes has brought together an identification of the commission or ruling body of the most powerful organized crime elements operating in the United States. This follows an active effort, national effort, an effort accentuated by President Reagan 2 years ago when we were given a presidential commission to go out and break up the mob, that has seen in 1983 1,300, and they've involved most of the techniques that we have been able to muster, including over 80 court-authorized electronic surveillances. Extensive physical and electronic surveillance, the use of cooperative witnesses, and we didn't have cooperating witnesses in the past because of the code of silence. We do today, either unnoticed or unapplied to the existence of the Commission and its criminal activities. The District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, here in New York, all have cooperated in this tremendous effort. Including hits and murders. That leadership disputes are settled through the Commission. The ability to bring the entire Commission under the RICO statute means now that the major muscle for organized criminal enterprises in the United States has now been brought to the bar of justice. Intimidation, coercion, and violence in the past have been the principal avenue for bringing drugs and narcotics into this country that have supported the major areas of criminal activity, bribery, prostitution, gambling, a thing of the past.
Next, we'll ask Stephen Trott to speak. Steve Trott, the Attorney General. At that time, Attorney General Smith placed Steve Trott, the head of the criminal division, as the contact point for this case. And throughout the 18 or 19 months that it has been, the crime section in the Department of Justice have been absolutely invaluable in putting this case together. And all of us here in New York appreciate that kind of spirit and cooperation very, very much. Steve?
I simply want to say that we've had, as one of our main targets over the years, the mob. We've been very effective at doing that. But this case that's being brought today really represents the bullseye. It's our expectation that this indictment that you've been handed today will operate as...
In terms of bringing all of us together with regard to this indictment. This is a historic, landmark indictment. It's historic and landmark because we're getting at the top 5, the structure and how it works. And this is extraordinarily important. The other reason this indictment is a landmark indictment is because it could not...
And we really feel like we operate as one unit. At approximately the same time that we went and briefed District Attorney
General, Kings County District Attorney Office, the FBI, the State Police, and the New York City Police Department, and I'm particularly proud of the very significant work on all of us, every day, in almost everything that we do. And increasingly, they're taking over control of legitimate enterprise. And if this kind of cooperative effort isn't continued to put a stop to them, it's only a matter of time when they will control us. Thank you very much, and congratulations again.
Families, which was established for and served the purpose of resolving disputes among the competing interests of those families. The Southern District and the Eastern District, we had cross-designated assistants, and we went to Giuliani, gave him the information, worked with him, and the indictments that you have before you are the results of that.
Called me, I think it was 2 or 2.5 years ago, concerned about the fact that New York State does not have a RICO statute. And at that time, he was holding hearings and putting on a great deal of pressure in order to get a RICO statute passed in the state. He is one of the leaders in that regard, probably the leader in New York State, for getting a RICO statute in New York so that New York can join really at the prosecutorial level in full partnership in making these cases. And it's a great privilege to introduce him. He is in charge of knowledge. He came in after we all sat down, but they played a very significant role in this case. The New York State Police, Inspector David Lutweiler is here, and the New York State Police serves as the investigative arm for the Organized Crime Task Force, and they played a very, very crucial role in this case. I'm very happy for my office to hear all. I have an organized crime unit in my office headed by Barbara Jones. It was headed previously by Walter Mack. That is just the most incredible group of lawyers that you're going to find anywhere. An incredible group of dedicated, intelligent, brilliant people who work 14, 15, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can
of bosses and senior officers of 5 La Cosa Nostra families in New York, as well as from time to time.
And these allegedly being men of honor, as they call themselves, are going to get a little bent out of shape about that. One guy saying another guy's not the boss, and another guy saying that the other guy married the right woman and that's how he got ahead, and so on and so forth. Do you think that this is going to cause the kind of personal friction that's going to have them start whacking each other out?
Well, I mean,
indictments total. A number of persons identified as being soldiers, capos, capodicines in the Cosa Nostra in the Mafia. Nationwide, Kansas City down, St. Louis City, top's gone down, Boston, Philadelphia, New York City now, along with California. What is substantively the position of the Mafia today? Does it exist as an integral organization? Is it scattered a bit? Is it reuniting? What is it doing?
I think I'd like to ask Director Webster to answer that question. He would have...
Well, it'd just be my personal assessment of where I think we are. As you pointed out, there have been major hits against major players in every national crime, every prominent crime family in the country. But what we really are seeing is the level of information, cooperation, and vulnerability that is emerging from this as we have been able to reach beyond the streets up into the upper echelons of each of these organized crime families. And with this indictment, we take on the symbol of power, the symbol of control and coordination.
What is your conviction rate, and what do you expect to be your conviction rate of these major figures?
Well, I don't really like to use conviction percentages, and I certainly don't want to predict that we are going to convict anybody or not convict anybody.
Well, are they using the Sicilians because there's a shortage of men in the United States?
Well, if you put both indictments together, the Badalamenti indictment and this indictment, what you essentially had,
we typically didn't have in the past.
Did any of these people put up a fight when they were arrested this morning?
No, they were arrested without incident. It's my understanding one was in the hospital and 2 others checked into the hospital.
One other question. This talks about the labor union corruption here in New York, and Professor Blakey, who was referred to here earlier, says that the only way that we really can end up going after...
Indictment being at the top isn't always the best, I think, anymore.
Mr. Giuliani, in early February, we reported that you traveled personally to Tucson to interview Joe Bonanno, the
actions of the mayor and of the police commissioner, and the minor assistance that we give them with Federal Day and bringing cases into the federal court so that we can help to some extent with that problem are things that we do also. So that one of the things that happens when you announce an indictment like this that I guess is always somewhat frustrating for us is you concentrate on this case and it sounds like, well, maybe we're not doing anything else. I mean, they were bring something to it. The fact of the Mafia historically has done great damage to Italian Americans directly. When they were coming here at the turn of the century, it was the Mafia, the Black Hand, the Camarista, and those groups that lived off Italian American immigrants and took what few dollars they made. And since then, the Mafia at its height was only a very small, minuscule proportion of the Italian Americans in the United States. And if you consider that in comparison to any other group that has a percentage of people that violate the law, it was probably no greater than and smaller than most. So that Italian Americans have been disconnected from and have had nothing to do with the Mafia, and most of them feel more strongly opposed to the Mafia than probably anybody else in our society, but they've been hurt by the existence of it. And I would see it as a very, very fine day for Italian Americans if we could rid ourselves of it in reality, and there'd no longer be a Mafia. And then prejudiced people would have nothing to pick on. Probably they'd find something else, but at least that one would be gone. Thank you. The hospital will be important.
They can be walked through and go
Should be used to trials, I guess.
Yeah, both of you here, please. Wait, I can't get a shot.
Come on, you can come with your right, please.
Right in the front, finish.
This way, please, sir.
Guys, roll it out. Give me 2 friends. Thank you. 1, 2.
Oh, good. Nice to meet you. Yeah. Here, please. Right over here. This way. Very good. Thank you.
Wait just a second.
Hold this down.
Please. Move your head out of the way.
Stop pulling the cord! I think the Mafia is fighting back. There they go. The mob is fighting back.
A little bit.
Are they going to be allowed to ask bail, or is bail conditioned for these people? No, they'll work out some kind of bail. They will have the opportunity. Yes, they'll probably work out bail. Most of these people have a very, very good bail history. They've been tried before, they show up, they have a lot of property, so it's very difficult to hold them.
Are they being held on the Metropolitan Correctional Facility?
Yeah, somewhere in the hospital. Yes. The interesting thing are there are a couple of mob guys that went into the hospital thinking they were going to get indicted just now. And we didn't name.
They wouldn't be getting out today.
Oh yeah, that's right. Some of them will probably get out today.
About what time?
Paul Castellano, Fat Tony.
About what time?
After 3. Sometime after 3.
They'll make.
You wouldn't take them to the tunnel. If they post bail, they'll have to come out the front, right?
Once they post bail, they're no longer in our custody. They just walk out wherever they want. They probably have to go out the front or the Pearl Street side.
It's either one or the other street. There are no special accommodations. Right? 2 ways to get out of federal court. Side Pearl Street.
You know, there's a third way. You can, if somebody's really sneaky, you can go on the subway, right?
There will be no mug shots available of these.
I don't think so. We don't have any.
One more thing.
Pardon me?
He was down here. I don't know where he is.
No, they are already in the federal building. They're going to be arraigned at 3 o'clock. After that,
How long will that take?
at least 2 of them, I know, will be able to post bail immediately. Castellano, yeah, and Fat Tony.
How long?
I mean, a couple of million, plus a couple $1 million.
How long will they be before they get out? Before they walk out? Probably help them.
The proceeding will probably be about a half hour, 45 minutes.
How long from now?
3 o'clock. They can't be any earlier than that. It'll be in the millions of dollars.
Is there a cement company?
Bob Miller, please come to the desk. Bob Miller. Bob Miller.
Well, you won't be able to photograph them in court.
Bob Miller,
But they have to. The ones that make bail will leave court.
Right. That's true.
They will leave at.
But right now they're in your custody, and
right now they're in the custody of the FBI. Actually, they're in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons.
But they're locked up in the Manhattan.
Exactly right.
Is there a